Karen had dreamed of this house for decades. It was not just a home, it was her sanctuary. Nestled deep in the woods, the cabin was surrounded by towering pine and oak trees, their branches swaying gently in the wind. The sunlight streamed through in golden beams during the day, and at night, the moonlight spilled silver across the forest floor. The house itself was charming, with wooden beams, stone accents, and large windows that framed the forest like living paintings. Every detail had been carefully chosen, from the rustic fireplace in the living room to the cozy reading nook by the window. This was Karen's escape from the chaos of her life in the city, a place where she could finally breathe freely, alone or with her family. The first weekend after moving in, Karen invited her daughter Emma and her husband, David, to see the house. Emma had always loved nature, and the moment she stepped into the cabin, her eyes lit up. "Mom, this is perfect," she exclaimed, running her fingers over the wooden countertops. "It's so warm and cozy. I can't believe you did all this for us." Karen smiled warmly, pleased to see her daughter happy. She led them through the house, showing every corner, the spacious kitchen, the living room with the fireplace, the small library, and finally the bedroom that overlooked the forest. Emma's excitement was infectious, but Karen's heart grew heavy when she noticed David lagging behind. He was examining the house with a critical eye, running his fingers along the beams, tapping the walls lightly, and staring at the layout as if calculating something. Finally, David stopped in the living room and turned to Karen with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mom," he said casually, "this house is beautiful. Really, it's perfect. You know, it's so big, maybe my parents could stay here too. It would be more comfortable than their apartment." Karen froze. Her mind raced. She forced a polite smile, but inside, a storm was brewing. "Oh, I see. You mean, move them in?" David nodded, leaning casually against the wall. "Yeah. They're lonely, you know. And this place has so much space. It could be nice to have family close. Think of it as bonding." Karen swallowed hard. Her sanctuary, her home, her peaceful retreat, was suddenly under threat. She realized David had not asked her, he had assumed she would agree. His casual tone, as if this were a favor for them rather than a demand on her life, made her blood boil quietly. She managed to keep her voice calm. "Well, we can discuss it," she said carefully, hiding the anger she felt. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her upset. David's smirk, subtle but unmistakable, told her he thought he had already won. Emma, oblivious to the tension, bounced around the room, laughing and commenting on the furniture. "I love this reading nook, Mom. And the fireplace. Can we sit here for tea?" Karen hugged her daughter, thankful for her innocence, but her mind never left the subtle trap being set by her son-in-law. The next morning, Karen awoke to the sound of movement downstairs. The sun had just begun to rise, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. As she went to the living room, she found a surprising scene. Boxes labeled with the Thompsons' names, David's parents, were already stacked neatly in corners. They had arrived without any announcement, their belongings spilling into Karen's carefully arranged home. Mr. Thompson smiled warmly at her, his presence commanding. "Karen, this is such a wonderful home. We thought we'd settle in a little early. I hope you don't mind." Karen's jaw tightened. She forced a smile, stepping carefully around the boxes. "Oh, welcome. I didn't expect you so soon." Mrs. Thompson clucked and arranged a vase of flowers on the kitchen counter, patting it proudly. "We just want to make it feel like home. Isn't that what family is for?" Karen's mind raced. She understood now that David had orchestrated this. It wasn't a casual suggestion, it was a plan. A way to take over her home without confrontation. Her heart thudded, but she forced herself to breathe calmly. She knew anger would cloud her judgment. Patience and careful observation were the keys. The Thompsons, oblivious to Karen's inner turmoil, began moving through the house as if it were theirs. Mr. Thompson immediately started fiddling with the thermostat, claiming it was too cold. Mrs. Thompson complained about the kitchen setup, muttering about the pantry's organization and the placement of the cutlery. David hovered near them, occasionally smirking at Karen, clearly enjoying her discomfort. Karen decided that confrontation would not work, not yet. Instead, she would observe, learn their habits, and plan. She noticed small weaknesses, Mr. Thompson's obsession with control, Mrs. Thompson's vanity, and their tendency to argue when things did not go their way. Late that afternoon, Karen slipped outside into the surrounding forest. The tall pines and oaks created a canopy that filtered the sunlight, casting moving shadows across the leaf-strewn ground. The air smelled fresh, sharp, and invigorating. Karen felt alive, and as she walked, her mind began spinning ideas for her little surprises. She would not confront them directly. She would make the house itself resist their intrusion, subtly and cleverly. When she returned to the cabin, Karen began setting small traps. She rearranged a few chairs and rugs in the living room, just enough to confuse Mr. Thompson when he attempted to claim his favorite seat. She replaced sugar with salt in the sugar jar, harmless, but unpleasant. She moved a small mirror in the hallway that reflected light in strange ways, making Mrs. Thompson frown every time she walked past. Over the next several hours, Karen quietly watched her guests. David began showing signs of impatience, trying to control the situation but failing in subtle ways. The Thompsons whispered to each other, blaming each other for the small inconveniences, unaware that someone else had set the events in motion. Karen's satisfaction grew. That night, the wind rustled through the trees outside, and the house creaked slightly under the stormy sky. Karen lit the fireplace and sat in her favorite armchair, thinking about the next steps. Her plan was simple: observe, gather information, and implement subtle psychological tricks that would make the Thompsons feel unwelcome without harming anyone. She reflected on David's personality. Prideful, impatient, and always needing control, these traits would be his undoing. The Thompsons' vanity and greed made them perfect targets for harmless but irritating surprises. Karen smiled softly to herself. They thought they were taking over her home. They were about to learn who really controlled it. Hours passed. Karen quietly noted every habit, every reaction, every word. She wrote in her journal, "Observation is key. Patience will win. Every action will have consequences." She placed the journal under her pillow and lay awake, listening to the night. The forest was quiet, but her mind raced. She felt the thrill of strategy, the satisfaction of planning. Before sleeping, she peeked out the window. The moonlight shone on the tall pines, the shadows stretching long across the ground. She whispered softly, "If they think this house is theirs, they are mistaken. And soon, they will see." Karen's first day in her Woodland home had ended, but the real story was only beginning. The battle between her, David, and his parents had started silently. And Karen, clever, patient, and observant, was ready for whatever came next. The morning after the Thompsons' arrival, Karen woke early, as always. The soft hum of the forest greeted her, and sunlight poured through the tall windows, casting long golden beams across the wooden floor. She rose quietly, careful not to disturb her guests, and began her daily observation. This was her sanctuary, and she needed to defend it cleverly. Downstairs, David's parents were already moving about. Mr. Thompson had gone straight to the thermostat, muttering complaints about the air temperature. Mrs. Thompson, meanwhile, had spread her belongings across the living room, claiming that it felt more homely this way. Karen paused by the staircase, watching them from above, noting every motion, every gesture, every detail. She began implementing subtle disruptions. She moved chairs slightly off their usual spots, placed a small stack of magazines where Mrs. Thompson's feet normally rested, and shifted the placement of a rug near Mr. Thompson's favorite seat. Nothing dangerous, just enough to irritate and confuse. By mid-morning, Karen began her first psychological trick. She deliberately left the living room lights flickering in odd patterns. The electricity in the old cabin had occasional quirks, and she used them to her advantage. As the Thompsons entered the room, the flickering lights made shadows dance across the walls. Mr. Thompson frowned, moving his hand across his eyes. "What's going on with the lights?" he muttered. David, standing nearby, tried to explain. "It's an old cabin. Probably just a fuse issue." But his voice lacked conviction, and Karen watched the subtle worry in his expression. He had not anticipated that his mother-in-law would notice small anomalies and become unsettled. Karen smiled quietly to herself. Observation and patience were powerful weapons. She returned upstairs to her room, noting every reaction in her journal. She wrote, "They think they can take control. They are overconfident. Every mistake they make reveals their weakness. Continue the plan." Lunch was tense. Karen served food, making sure everything was perfectly normal, but she had hidden tiny, harmless surprises. The sugar in the coffee had a faintly salty taste, and the napkins had been slightly dampened. Mrs. Thompson's eyes widened as she sipped, and Mr. Thompson furrowed his brow. "Something's not right," David muttered, taking a sip himself. Karen continued to act as if nothing were happening. She smiled warmly, chatting casually with Emma, who was unaware of the subtle chaos. Emma laughed and commented on how cozy the cabin was. "Mom, it's perfect here. I could live like this forever," she said. Karen's heart swelled, but her mind remained alert. She couldn't let David's arrogance ruin this home. As afternoon approached, Karen moved her strategy further. She began manipulating small aspects of the house to make it feel mysterious to the Thompsons. A door that normally closed easily now creaked just enough to startle them. Lights in the hallway turned on and off with slight delays. Small gusts of wind entered through slightly open windows, causing curtains to flutter eerily. Every subtle touch was designed to create unease without revealing her hand. By mid-afternoon, the tension in the house was palpable. The Thompsons whispered to each other, blaming minor inconveniences on one another. David's frustration grew as he tried to keep the situation under control. "Mom, Dad, it's just an old house," he said, but his voice wavered, betraying his concern. Karen noticed and smiled. The plan was working. Karen decided to escalate further. She enlisted the help of Jake, her neighbor, who was loyal and discreet. Together, they set small, harmless traps around the house. A chair in the hallway was placed slightly askew so someone would trip lightly if not careful. A cup of water was balanced near the edge of the counter, ready to spill at the slightest touch. Jake laughed quietly, impressed by Karen's cleverness. "You really know how to get them without them realizing it," he whispered. As night fell, the forest around the cabin grew dark and mysterious. The wind howled through the trees, and shadows stretched across the yard. Karen watched the forest from the window, feeling a thrill. The house itself became an ally. Every creak, every flicker, every rustle outside contributed to the atmosphere of suspense she had carefully cultivated. David and his parents tried to retreat to the living room, but the lights flickered, the rug shifted, and a small breeze caused the curtains to flap violently. Mrs. Thompson gasped, clutching her pearls. Mr. Thompson cursed under his breath, looking around for the source. David's eyes darted toward Karen, trying to read her expression. She smiled innocently. The Thompsons' discomfort grew with every passing hour. Small arguments erupted. Mr. Thompson blamed Mrs. Thompson for knocking over a cup of coffee, and Mrs. Thompson accused him of exaggerating. David tried to mediate, but his authority was undermined subtly by every minor disruption Karen orchestrated. Karen retreated to her study, where she documented everything in her journal. Every small reaction, every whisper, every gesture was recorded. She planned for the next day's surprises. She had learned that subtlety was more effective than confrontation. The more the Thompsons felt unwelcome without realizing the cause, the more control she maintained. Late that night, Karen took a walk in the forest. The moonlight was bright, and the trees cast long, moving shadows. She felt a rush of excitement. This was her domain. She whispered to herself, "They thought they could take this house from me. Tomorrow, they will begin to see who really owns it." Returning to the cabin, Karen noticed a small note slipped under her door. It read, "We're coming back tomorrow. Get ready." She smiled. It was probably David, trying to assert control. But she was ready. She had planned carefully, and every action she took had been deliberate. The next morning, Karen awoke early, more energized than ever. She prepared breakfast with precision, hiding small surprises in the most unexpected places. Sugar, salt, small noises, subtle movements, all part of her strategy. By mid-morning, the Thompsons were already restless. David tried to appear calm, but Karen noticed the twitch in his eye, the tightness in his jaw. Every little inconvenience she had planted over the past day had amplified their discomfort. As the day unfolded, Karen executed the final phase of her plan. She arranged the furniture so that every movement the Thompsons made caused minor irritation. She orchestrated lights and shadows, creating a subtle sense of mystery and tension. The house itself seemed alive, resisting their presence. By evening, The Thompsons were tense, exhausted, and frustrated. David was visibly angry but powerless to stop the subtle chaos. Karen remained calm, sipping her tea by the fireplace, enjoying the sight of her house defending itself. The forest outside was quiet, but inside, tension simmered. Karen knew the next day would be even more critical. She had carefully observed, planned, and executed the first phase of her clever strategy. The Thompsons were now questioning their own behavior, unsure why the house felt so unwelcome. Karen's mind wandered to the final surprise she had prepared. It would be subtle but undeniable. By the end of the week, the Thompsons would learn that the house could not be taken by force, that patience, observation, and intelligence were more powerful than arrogance and entitlement. As she went to bed that night, Karen felt a mix of anticipation and satisfaction. Her sanctuary was intact, her clever plan unfolding perfectly. The first battle was over, but the war for her woodland home was only just beginning. The morning sun barely broke through the tall pines when Karen awoke, already alert. The forest was quiet, but her mind raced. Yesterday's subtle tricks had worked perfectly. David and his parents were now visibly unsettled, their sense of control slipping with every small disruption Karen had planted. She smiled quietly to herself. Patience and careful planning had always been her strongest weapons, and she intended to use them fully. As she moved through the cabin, Karen took in the evidence of her first victories. A slightly askew rug in the hallway, a cup precariously perched on the edge of the counter, and the flickering lights that had so unsettled the Thompsons. Everything was in place. Today, she would escalate. Downstairs, the Thompsons were already stirring. Mr. Thompson muttered irritably about the temperature, fiddling with the thermostat. Karen observed silently from the stairs, noting the way his frustration was growing. Mrs. Thompson, meanwhile, was fussing with the curtains, complaining that they blocked too much sunlight. David hovered nearby, attempting to maintain calm, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. Karen moved to the kitchen, brewing coffee and preparing breakfast, her movements deliberate and calm. She added subtle disruptions, a hint of salt in the sugar container, a slightly uneven placement of plates and utensils. These small annoyances would compound over the day, increasing the Thompsons' sense that something was off, but they would not suspect her involvement. Emma, blissfully unaware of the tension, wandered into the kitchen. "Mom, this is amazing," she said cheerfully. "I love it here. It feels like a real escape." Karen smiled at her daughter, grateful for the innocence she represented. But her mind remained sharp, focused on her plan. She could not let David's arrogance and his parents' entitlement take over her home. By mid-morning, the subtle psychological war was well underway. Karen orchestrated small, eerie occurrences around the cabin, doors that creaked open by themselves, lights that flickered without cause, and slight, unexplained drafts that moved curtains. The Thompsons noticed these events and exchanged nervous glances, blaming one another for the disturbances. Karen watched, taking careful notes in her journal. Every reaction, every whispered complaint, every subtle misstep was recorded. She was building a comprehensive map of their behaviors, their weaknesses, and their insecurities. By the end of the day, she would know exactly how to push them further, without ever directly confronting them. Lunch brought new opportunities. Karen prepared a seemingly normal meal, but she had hidden tiny surprises in the most unexpected places. The coffee was slightly too bitter, the napkins dampened, and small objects had been placed in ways that would cause minor disruptions as the Thompsons moved about the table. As they ate, Mrs. Thompson complained about the taste, while Mr. Thompson spilled a small amount of coffee on the tablecloth. David tried to intervene, but his frustration was growing. Karen observed quietly, noting the increasing tension. "Observation first, action second," she whispered to herself. "Every mistake they make is evidence of their entitlement." After lunch, Karen decided it was time to escalate further. She enlisted the help of Jake, her loyal neighbor, who was more than willing to assist. Together, they set harmless yet highly effective traps around the house. A chair was placed just slightly off its usual spot so someone would trip lightly. A cup of water balanced on the edge of the counter threatened a minor spill. Small items were subtly moved, causing mild confusion and irritation. The Thompsons began to argue quietly. Mr. Thompson blamed Mrs. Thompson for knocking over a cup of coffee, while Mrs. Thompson accused him of being careless. David tried to mediate, but his authority was undermined subtly at every turn. Karen's satisfaction grew as she watched their frustration mount. By late afternoon, Karen moved on to more intricate tricks. She began manipulating lights and shadows to create an eerie atmosphere. Curtains were positioned to cast long, shifting shapes across the walls, and mirrors reflected light in odd ways, causing the Thompsons to question what they were seeing. The house seemed alive, responding to their intrusion, and Karen's careful orchestration made it impossible for them to trace the disturbances back to her. As evening approached, the forest outside grew darker, the wind picking up and sending waves of rustling through the trees. Karen lit the fireplace, creating warm light and casting long shadows across the room. She positioned herself near a window, watching the Thompsons closely. They moved cautiously through the house, each minor disruption adding to their unease. David's frustration was palpable. He muttered under his breath, clearly trying to maintain control while failing repeatedly. The Thompsons whispered to each other, blaming one another for the strange occurrences. Karen quietly noted every detail. Her plan was working perfectly. Dinner brought the next phase of her strategy. Karen served a lavish meal, making sure every element seemed normal. But she had carefully hidden additional surprises. Small noises were timed to occur as the Thompsons reached for objects. The flickering lights intensified slightly, casting shadows that moved unpredictably. The Thompsons became increasingly tense, their faces reflecting growing unease. Karen maintained her composure, chatting casually with Emma and pretending everything was normal. Every gesture, every word, every subtle smile was carefully calculated to maintain her cover. The Thompsons' sense of control was slipping further, while Karen's confidence grew. After dinner, Karen retreated to her study to review her notes and plan the next day's actions. She documented every reaction, every whispered complaint, every sign of frustration or fear. She was preparing for the ultimate reveal, the moment when her cleverness would fully manifest. Late that night, Karen took a walk in the forest. The moonlight was bright, casting long, moving shadows. The wind rustled through the trees, and the forest seemed alive. Karen felt a thrill of anticipation. The Thompsons believed they were asserting control, but in reality, every step they had taken had been guided by her plan. Returning to the cabin, Karen paused to observe her home. It was quiet now, but the tension from the day lingered. She whispered to herself, "They think they are in control. Tomorrow, they will learn who really owns this house." She went to bed that night with a sense of calm determination. The battle for her woodland sanctuary was far from over, but Karen knew she had the upper hand. Every move, every subtle disruption, every minor inconvenience had been designed to teach David and his parents a lesson in patience, respect, and boundaries. As she drifted off to sleep, the forest around the cabin whispered in the wind, and Karen smiled. She was ready for the next day, ready to escalate her clever plan, and ready to ensure that her sanctuary remained hers, no matter what David and his parents tried. The Thompsons slept uneasily, their dreams haunted by the small, inexplicable events of the day. David tossed and turned, frustrated by his inability to control the situation. And Karen, quietly observing from her room, knew that the real challenge and the true satisfaction was still to come. The morning after the longest week of her life, Karen awoke with a calm sense of purpose. The forest outside her woodland home was quiet, shrouded in mist, with the tall pines swaying gently in the morning breeze. Birds chirped softly, as if they, too, were aware that today would be different. Karen felt a thrill of anticipation. She had spent days observing, planning, and executing subtle psychological maneuvers that had slowly unbalanced David and his parents. Today, it would all come together. Downstairs, the Thompsons were already stirring. Mr. Thompson was fidgeting with the thermostat, muttering complaints, while Mrs. Thompson fussed with the arrangement of the living room cushions, each small inconvenience amplified by the subtle manipulations Karen had left in place. David hovered between them, attempting to mediate, but his frustration was evident. He was starting to realize that the house itself seemed to resist them. Karen descended the stairs quietly, holding a tray of breakfast with steaming mugs of coffee. Her smile was warm, perfectly innocent, but behind it lay a sharp cunning. She placed the mugs down carefully, each one positioned so that the Thompsons would have to adjust themselves awkwardly to pick them up. The sugar and salt were placed as before, just enough to create minor confusion without raising immediate suspicion. As the family ate, Karen continued her quiet observation. Every glance, every movement, every whispered complaint was noted in her mind. She had learned their weaknesses over the past days: Mr. Thompson's obsession with control, Mrs. Thompson's vanity and impatience, and David's need to maintain a facade of authority despite growing frustration. Each of these traits would play into the final stage of her plan. After breakfast, Karen excused herself, claiming she needed to tend to some errands around the house. In reality, she was setting the stage for the ultimate reveal. She strategically placed subtle reminders of their misbehavior around the cabin: slightly misaligned furniture, objects that moved when touched, and small notes tucked in corners with cryptic messages. Each detail was designed to make the Thompsons question themselves and each other, heightening the sense of unease. By mid-morning, the tension in the cabin was palpable. David's parents were whispering constantly, their irritation mounting. David's attempts to maintain control were growing desperate. Karen, observing discreetly, felt a surge of satisfaction. The Thompsons were beginning to unravel, their arrogance and entitlement turning against them in a series of perfectly orchestrated inconveniences. Karen decided it was time to escalate further. She enlisted the help of Jake, her loyal neighbor, who had been quietly assisting her from the sidelines. Together, they implemented a series of harmless yet highly effective surprises. Lights flickered in rooms where the Thompsons were, doors creaked in empty hallways, and soft, mysterious noises echoed through the house at carefully timed intervals. The Thompsons began to feel a creeping sense of fear, unsure of what was happening or who was responsible. By afternoon, Karen set the centerpiece of her plan into motion. She invited the family to a celebratory lunch to mark the end of the week. The Thompsons assumed this meant she was conceding control, but in reality, it was a trap. Karen had prepared a lavish meal, but every element was a subtle test. Notes were hidden under napkins with messages that humorously called out their entitlement: "This seat is not yours, remember, respect is earned, and this house does not forget." As the Thompsons reached for their food, small triggers she had planted earlier activated. A chair slid slightly as Mrs. Thompson leaned on it, causing her to stumble. A cup teetered precariously on the edge of the counter, spilling just a few drops of water. Lights flickered, casting long, shifting shadows across the room. The Thompsons began to panic quietly, their nerves fraying as they realized the house was behaving strangely. David's frustration boiled over. "Mom! Dad! Stop it! This isn't funny," he shouted, his voice cracking slightly. But Karen remained calm, sipping her tea, a serene smile on her face. She watched as David's parents argued quietly among themselves, blaming one another for every minor inconvenience. Mr. Thompson accused his wife of being careless, while Mrs. Thompson muttered that he was overreacting. The tension was almost tangible. Karen decided it was time for the final phase. She had arranged for a local property inspector to arrive the following morning, under the guise of checking the safety and functionality of the cabin. Any attempt by the Thompsons to claim the house would now be impossible without legal ramifications. She knew this would cement her victory, and it was the perfect conclusion to her carefully crafted strategy. The afternoon wore on, and the Thompsons' anxiety grew. Every shadow, every flicker of light, every subtle sound seemed amplified in their minds. David tried desperately to maintain composure, but Karen's plan had carefully undermined him at every turn. He was powerless to stop the unfolding chaos. As evening approached, Karen prepared for the final confrontation. She called everyone into the living room under the pretext of a family meeting. The Thompsons, already on edge, sat uneasily on the slightly shifted furniture. David's face was tight with frustration, his hands trembling slightly. Karen began speaking, her voice calm and steady. "I know you've been trying to make yourselves at home here," she said, smiling politely. "But this house isn't just a building. It's a sanctuary. It's a place I worked hard for, and it deserves respect." She paused, letting her words sink in. The Thompsons shifted nervously. She continued, revealing the subtle manipulations she had orchestrated over the past week. Every misplaced chair, every flickering light, every small inconvenience was explained as part of a carefully designed plan to show them how it feels to impose themselves on someone else's space. The Thompsons' faces fell, realization dawning. David looked at his wife and parents, shocked. He hadn't expected Karen to be so clever, so meticulous. Karen smiled warmly, her tone gentle but firm. "I wanted you to understand," she said. "This house belongs to me, and no one can take it without respect and consideration." She allowed a pause, letting the weight of her words settle. The Thompsons were silent, ashamed, and frustrated, their arrogance deflated. David attempted to argue, but Karen remained unyielding. She reminded him of the property inspector scheduled for the next day and subtly hinted at legal consequences should they attempt any further intrusion. The Thompsons exchanged glances, their pride shattered. They had been thoroughly outsmarted, their sense of entitlement completely undone. Karen's victory was complete, but she did not gloat. Instead, she allowed the family a dignified exit, offering polite guidance on how to leave the house without further incident. The Thompsons, humbled and defeated, complied silently, their lesson learned. David's attempts to salvage his pride were futile. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that Karen's intelligence and patience were far greater than his own arrogance. Once the Thompsons had left, Karen closed the door behind them, locking it carefully. The forest outside was calm, the mist rolling gently through the pines. Karen breathed deeply, feeling the weight of tension lift from her shoulders. Her sanctuary was intact, her cleverness had prevailed, and the lesson had been delivered without harm. She wandered through her home, checking that everything was in order. The subtle signs of her clever manipulation remained, a quiet reminder of her strategic mind. She smiled, knowing that she had protected her space and ensured her peace would remain undisturbed. Later, Karen invited Emma to sit with her by the fireplace. "Mom," Emma said softly, "I had no idea what was happening with Dad and his parents. You handled it so perfectly." Karen hugged her daughter, feeling a warm sense of satisfaction. "Sometimes," she said gently, "you have to be clever to protect what matters most." The forest outside whispered in the night, the wind carrying the scent of pine and earth. Karen sat quietly, sipping her tea, the house peaceful around her. She knew she had won. Her patience, observation, and intelligence had outmatched arrogance and entitlement. And in her woodland sanctuary, Karen could finally breathe freely, knowing that no one could take it from her. As she gazed out the window at the moonlit forest, she whispered softly to herself, "Some surprises are worth the wait. And some lessons are unforgettable." The battle for her home was over. Karen's cleverness had prevailed, and her woodland sanctuary was safe. She leaned back in her chair, a satisfied smile on her face, listening to the soft rustle of the trees. The Thompsons and David had learned their lesson, and Karen could finally enjoy the peace she had fought so cleverly to protect.